Good afternoon. Thank you for joining the Foreign Presser Japan's online press briefing. I am Maiko Fukasawa, Director of Media Communication and Planning Division of the Foreign Press Center Japan. I will moderate today's press briefing. Less than a month remains until U.S. presidential election in November. In national polls, Democratic candidate Vice President Kamala Harris and Republican candidate former President Donald Trump show similar levels of popularity, and the race is expected to continue to be close. It is our great pleasure today to welcome Dr. Satoru Mori, a contemporary international politics professor at Keio University, to talk about the outlook for the U.S. presidential election, including key points for this election and the impact on Japan-U.S. relations. First, I would like to make 3 housekeeping announcements. Number 1, Dr. Mori will speak for 30 minutes using a resume, followed by a 30-minute Q&A session. Please note that today's session is in English only. Number 2, please send your questions in English using the Q&A function at the bottom of the screen. You may post your questions anytime after the briefing starts. Number 3, we have posted a link of today's handout in the Q&A box for you to download. Dr. Mori, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. First of all, I want to thank the Foreign Press Center of Japan for inviting me to this briefing session. It's a great privilege to be able to speak before a distinguished audience. The title of my talk today is Outlook for U.S. Presidential Election and Future of Japan-U.S. Relations. But as many of you know, the only outlook for the U.S. presidential election is that we won't know the result until the ballots are opened. And Japan time, November 6th or maybe 7th will be the time when the results of the presidential election will probably be reported and be known to the world. And so we'll have to wait for that opening of the ballot. So today, what I would like to do is sort of focus on the foreign policy consequences of this U.S. presidential election, meaning that I would like to talk about what kind of possible policy directions a possible second Trump administration or a Harris administration may pursue, and what are some of the implications for Japan and how Japan might possibly consider how to respond to some of those policy initiatives undertaken by either a Trump administration or a Harris administration. So I want to start by making some general points related to the international consequences of the U.S. presidential election. So this might be a sort of a repetition, but it's a remarkably close race. And as all of you know, the outcome of this presidential election is likely to be determined by the so-called battleground states or the swing states. And according to the latest polls, for example, one that came in yesterday was conducted by 538, an ABC News poll. Mr. Trump appears to be leading probably about 1 or 2 points in Georgia, North Carolina, and Arizona. And Vice President Harris is apparently leading in Michigan. And she's probably leading by less than 1 point in Nevada, Wisconsin, and Pennsylvania. But we will have to see. That's within the margin of error. So we don't really know whether she will prevail in those states. So we have to wait and see the results. So one of the, it's been a close race, but I think one of the conspicuous, the point that stands out in this presidential elections, particularly after President Biden stepped down from the presidential race, Vice President Harris has been leading Mr. Trump in terms of campaign contributions. I think it's quite impressive that she has raised a massive amount of money after she became the presidential candidate. And she's probably using them to sort of expand her support in some of these battleground states. So we'll see what the result is going to look like. And we'll have to probably wait until November 5th. The consequences of this election, as you know, is very big, particularly in terms of foreign policy. Not only in terms of domestic policy, but also in terms of foreign policy. And I think I will probably have to point out by saying that the two candidates actually have very contrasting views about US national interest. And this is a very basic point and yet very profound or fundamental point, I think, to sort of understand how Mr. Trump and how Vice President Harris view the world. And, having looked at many of his, remarks and some of the written materials about Mr. Trump, I think at the bottom, at the root of his notion of America First or his outlook on the world is this notion that US security interests are divisible from that of other states and regions, meaning that, US peace and prosperity can exist separately from the rest of the world, meaning that, US interests can be independent from other countries. And that kind of notion essentially creates the corollary of saying that if other states want protection from the United States, they must pay, and that US allies need to share a fair amount of burden, and they might even have to pay the United States for protection and so forth. And that's one aspect regarding security, right? US security is divisible from global security. I think that's one fundamental notion that Mr. Trump has. And secondly, in the area of economy, I think he takes essentially a mercantilist outlook, where he judges the value of other states on the basis of trade deficit and so forth. So from his view, I think what matters most is whether the United States is making money out of trade with other nations. And therefore, countries like Japan and maybe others can be sort of listed alongside US competitors like China and so forth. So that's the kind of worldview that he has towards the rest of the world. And I think that's going to drive some of his judgments, policy judgments, upon moving ahead his administration. In contrast, I think Kamala Harris's view of the world is quite the opposite, meaning that US interests are connected with other regions and also globally. And so that's why she tends to sort of emphasize and pick up the Democratic Party's agenda like climate change and human rights and global health and so forth. So that is why Democratic administrations, including the Biden administration, and also to some extent Obama administration, see a sort of a multilateral approach to international affairs as fundamentally important. And they also cherish US's traditional alliance systems in the area of security. But nevertheless, I'll come back to this, but in the area of economy, I think there is almost a sort of a bipartisan consensus that trade liberalization is out and managed trade is in, meaning that the US does not have the political incentive of pursuing trade liberalization, because that is understood in Washington, at least, to be detrimental to the US middle class and US workers. And therefore, I think it's very difficult right now to convince the United States to sort of join free trade agreements like the CPTPP and so forth. So those are some of the how should I say, point of departure of trying to trying to sort of think about the direction of US foreign policy starting in next year, in January. I think also it's important to look at the result of the Senate and House elections as well. Congress has considerable power over some issues, and particularly even on political issues as well, not only in terms of the budget and financial issues, but also in terms of political issues. For example, during the first Trump administration, Mr. Trump was very, how should I say, he was disinterested in human rights affairs. So when the Hong Kong problem came up, the Congress enacted what they call the Hong Kong Human Rights Policy Act. And apparently Trump didn't want to sign that bill, but because Congress was unified and had a supermajority in support in Congress, Mr. Trump apparently judged that if he refused to sign the bill and it went back to Congress and Congress overrided him by getting the support, passing the bill by a supermajority, he will be overridden and appear weak. And therefore, he ultimately went along and signed the bill. That has been reported in the media. I'm not quite sure whether that's true or not, but there is this possibility that Congress could have certain leverage over certain issues if they are unified enough on certain political issues like human rights and so forth. So I think it's also important to look at the legislature, the race in the Senate and the House. Experts in this field predict that because of the number of seats that are going to be challenged in both Senate and House, there is a chance that the Republicans might get the majority in the Senate and the Democrats might get the majority in the House. This is purely because of the seats, the number of seats that will be contested in this election. And I think in the Senate, more democratic seats are contested, and there is a chance that Republicans might win back some of the seats. And in the House, a larger number of Democratic seats are challenged and contested, and therefore there's a chance for the Republican seats are contested, and therefore the Democrats might have a chance to get the majority and so forth. But we'll have to see how this plays out as well. In corollary in parallel to the Vice President Harris's campaign money, I think Democratic Party has been pretty good at collecting political funds for their campaign, or the Congress people are getting more political funding from their supporters. And so perhaps the Democrats might have the upper hand in those terms, but we'll have to see how each election race will play out in the coming weeks and so forth. So to move on to the second section, I would like to talk briefly about the bilateral relationship between the United States and Japan. I think it's fair to say that neither candidate have actually elaborated their policy toward Japan. There's no specific agenda that they have raised during their campaign talk that they want to push against Japan. But I would imagine that a Harris administration would probably continue the existing programs for cooperation in diverse areas, ranging from security and economy all the way to diplomacy on various issues around the world. Because the relationship between Japan and the United States during the Biden administration has been so smooth and very positive, I sort of suspect that Vice President Harris probably hasn't paid a lot of attention to Japan-US relations. So she will probably have to be briefed from her Asia experts to be able to solidify and come up with specific agendas. But I imagine that it's very likely that she will probably continue pushing existing programs for cooperation in various areas. For a potential second Trump administration, it's hard to foresee what could become contentious, but he might demand the increase of Japan's defense budget, which is aimed to reach 2% of GDP by 2027, or some, in actual defense budget terms, it's probably about 1.6 or 7%. But nevertheless, the 2% is the GDP percentage target that the Japanese government is aiming right now by 2027. He might say, you must increase up to maybe 3% or so forth. But that could be a potential demand that Mr. Trump might pose to Japan. And during the first Trump administration, I think it was towards the end of the first Trump administration, he demanded the increase of the so-called host nation support, which is the budget, funding U.S. forces in Japan, the support of U.S. forces in Japan. So, expenses related to the various bases, U.S. bases inside Japan. Right now, the Japanese government apparently funds almost like 70% of the base related costs. So, increasing any further really doesn't make sense. I mean, one of the news reporting at the end of the Trump administration said that the Trump White House actually demanded 5 times as much as the existing funding, and that was very, very unrealistic. But that went away because that was ultimately towards the end of the Trump administration. I think they negotiated the final deal during the Biden administration, the first months of the Biden administration. But nevertheless, this host nation support issue might come back. And also with regard to Trump administration, I think Trump's policy toward third countries and regions will probably have important consequences for Japan, which I will elaborate in the next section. I think the Shiba government, in my sense, is that the Shiba government is unlikely to dramatically depart or deviate from existing policy. Japan already has a sort of a very rich program for cooperating with the United States in various areas, not only in areas of defense, which is, I think, is most solid and wide-ranging, but also in the areas of economic security and also issues related to diplomatic policy towards third countries and so forth. The reason why I say this is because Prime Minister Ishida's political capital, I think, will be affected by the two elections that is going to come up. The one is on the general election, which is scheduled to take place on October 27th, and there's going to be an upper house election next July. So, Prime Minister Ishiba, as you may know, those of you who are following Japanese domestic politics will know that apparently there is a tension inside the Liberal Democratic Party over the sort of the political funding scandal. And certain candidates, certain members of Diet will not be approved by the LDP formally for their during their campaign for the next election. And this is kind of creating a divisive effect inside the Liberal Democratic Party. So my guess is that Prime Minister Ishiba will face a sort of a challenge in terms of governing his own party in the months to come. And so he will be compelled to focus probably on intra-party politics and maybe domestic issues as well. So as a result of that, I think it will probably be difficult for him to push forward any controversial agenda. So he will probably opt to sort of continue and learn and get up to speed on what the existing policies are in the area of not only defense and security, but also on economic policy and also diplomacy in general and so forth. So that is what I kind of expect from the Ishiba government. So although I'll bring this up again later on, but although he has talked about state of forces agreement revision and so forth, those kind of issues I suspect will not come up. I think he will probably opt to sort of continue existing policy towards the United States. Now, moving on to the third section. Oh, I think you probably got this handout that I had the FPCJ distribute. I think will find it in the chat. I have this third section, which deals with US policy toward third countries and implications for Japan. And the first topic that I would raise under this section is the issue of managing three theaters, the European theater, Middle East theater, and the Indo-Pacific theater. For the Harris administration, I think the focus will be on conflict management, which means focusing on the Middle East and Ukraine. As some of you know, I think it was one of the US media did an interview on Vice President Harris, and she was asked, what do you think is the biggest threat to the United States? And she replied, Iran. And also she's obviously occupied with managing the conflict, the war in Ukraine. And so my sense is that Harris administration will be compelled to devote a lot of energy managing the conflict in the Middle East and Ukraine. Harris would probably want to maintain the responsibly managed stable competition with China and try to avoid military tension from rising in the Western Pacific. So she will probably try to avoid anything that might upset the Chinese. And so that's the area, the three theater management issue for Harris. She would probably sort of try to manage all three theaters. But inevitably, I think conflict management could become the center of her efforts. For the Trump administration, there, I think, will be more focus on competing and even confronting China. And that will also mean that he will try to end the war in Ukraine and probably want to urge Israel to end the war in Gaza. And I think he will, because of the Republican Party's approach towards Iran, there could be a stronger pressure on Iran. But a war with Iran will disrupt the oil market and the global economy, and ultimately the US economy as well. So he could be prudent on how he handles Iran. I think he doesn't really want to be bogged down into an armed conflict in the Middle East. So yes, there will be a strong sort of attitude, a more hawkish attitude toward Iran. But he will try to avoid having the tension between the conflict between Israel and Iran from escalating into a full-blown region-wide conflict. I think that's how he would want to manage. That's how he would want to manage the Middle East situation. So that's a general strategic direction that I would expect from the two administration. But what about each issue? The war in Ukraine, I think Trump could probably support and even provide long-range missiles, but at the same time, he will try to persuade Putin to come to the negotiating table. And so the idea, it's been well known that Mr. Trump has been saying that he's going to end the war in Ukraine very quickly, even within 24 hours of his assuming office as president. But the idea, I think, is to try to pressure both Ukraine and Russia, Mr. Zelensky and Mr. Putin, to come to the negotiating table and work out a ceasefire deal. I think that's going to be his goal. But I think it's not going to be easy because Ukraine will likely demand security guarantee from Western states, including the United States. But I suspect Mr. Trump will commit to Ukraine's accession to NATO. I don't think he will accept that. And I don't think he will be sort of, how should I say, positive about providing a meaningful security guarantee and only allow maybe for weapon sales for loans or something like that. And so Ukraine will be sort of exposed to a very vulnerable position. And we'll have to see how other NATO countries in Europe will try to provide security guarantees to Ukraine and so forth. So that's the one possible scenario that I would expect to see Mr. Trump administration from pursuing. Now, the implication for Japan is that Japan has been saying that Japan is strongly opposed to the change of status quo by force, because this has ramifications for East Asia as well. As many of you know, Prime Minister Kishida said, Ukraine today is East Asia tomorrow. And many Japanese experts and the government has been sort of emphasizing the interconnectedness of security in Europe and security in the Indo-Pacific. And so how would the Japanese government, as well as Japan in general, accept this kind of ceasefire? I think one of the way to sort of deal with the situation is to probably separate ceasefire and the territorial sovereignty issue. I think the only way to sort of reconcile these two conflicting, very difficult question is to say that cessation of hostilities does not mean accepting Russian sovereignty over occupied Ukrainian territory. And that is the only way that we can probably legitimize. So accepting and supporting a ceasefire deal does not mean that Japan will recognize Russian territorial aggrandizement in any way, not de facto, not de jure terms. So that's probably going to be the kind of sort of policy consideration that will have to be made. And I don't mean to suggest that this kind of cessation of hostilities will be realized anytime soon. I think it's going to be very, very difficult. But if certain conditions fall into place, and if some kind of ceasefire deal comes into the horizon, I think Japan will have to consider, not only Japan, but other countries too, but will have to consider how to sort of justifiably accept that kind of a new situation. And it doesn't mean a sort of a frozen conflict that's going to allow Russia to legitimize and justify territorial status quo, changing the territorial status quo by force. For Harris administration, I think it will continue to back Ukraine as long as it takes, but will face resource constraints. And I think the Middle East will also consume high attention and energy. And therefore, I think at the moment, there's probably about 60 or 70% of the Democratic Party supporters say that they can support Ukraine. They should support Ukraine indefinitely. But we'll have to see how that support will endure. If it stays at that high level, I think Kamala Harris can probably stay the course. But if domestic support begins to erode, then I think she will have to make tough decisions about how to approach the war in Ukraine. Now, moving on to the conflict in the Middle East, I think a Harris administration or Kamala Harris will make stronger demand against Israel to provide humanitarian consideration to Gaza and urge Israel to avoid escalating and expanding the conflict. And I think a Democratic Party administration is prone, and also Republican too, to try to avoid escalation and expansion of the regional conflict. And perhaps there might be a sort of a stronger effort by a Harris administration on Israel, but Israel, I think, will be making actions and making decisions on its own terms. So it remains to be seen whether that kind of U.S. Diplomatic influence will work out and compel Israel to sort of tamp down some of their existing operations. But nevertheless, that will be the attitude, basic approach of the Harris administration. For a possible Trump administration, I think they will support Israel, but demand an early end to the military operation in Gaza, I think. I think Mr. Trump has been saying that. And as I mentioned earlier, it will probably strongly oppose Iran as well, but try to avoid making the conflict escalate to a region-wide war. So that's going to be the basic attitude, a possible basic attitude of the Trump administration. Japan, the implication for Japan is that Japan will want to see the conflict contained in the region. And if it ever expands to Iran and has consequences for the Strait of Hormuz and the various kinds of energy transport route, then that's going to have significant impact on Japan as well. So from Japan's point of view, we would strongly want to see a U.S. administration work towards dampening tensions in the region. I think working out a sort of a political arrangement post-conflict is going to be very, very difficult after this armed conflict erupting. But nevertheless, it's an area where Japan also has interest in trying to sort of creating a sort of a more stable Middle East, which has been a long perennial challenge for all the countries that have stakes in the Middle East. But those two efforts, I think, will have to be pursued by Japan. Moving on to China policy, which is very, very consequential for Japan. For the Trump administration, Mr. Trump has declared that he's going to impose 60% tariffs on imports from China. And he's also said that he's going to impose 10% or maybe 20% import tariffs of tariffs on all imports from all countries. And this is once again going to have an impact on U.S.-China trade. And it could have sort of a diversion effect of maybe having Chinese exports go through third countries and then reaching U.S. shores. That could be a sort of a change in the trade pattern that might occur. I think Mr. Trump's ultimate goal in this area is to decrease and reduce American economy's dependence on Chinese economy. And I think this is different from the first term. During the first term, I think tariffs were used as a means to an end, and that was to conclude a phase one trade deal, which aimed to expand U.S. export to China. And it was a way to sort of pressure the Chinese to accept a phase one trade deal, which involved many other things. But what mattered for Mr. Trump was to expand the export of U.S. Farm products as well as other products to China, and thereby increase his political supporters in the United States and get a second term. But ultimately, that failed. This time around, if he does get this second term, he doesn't have another term, so I don't think he'll aim for political gains. But instead, I think he would want to sort of advance a sort of a more, how should I say, a fundamental goal of trying to reduce American reliance on Chinese products, and try to argue that it was the president that stopped China from exploiting the American economy, meaning that he would want to expand American production and American products for American consumers. And that kind of thinking, economic sort of autonomous, achieving economic autarkic even, thinking is probably at the base of his America First thinking in the area of trade. Regarding Taiwan, I think there's going to be a sort of a change from the Biden administration, in the sense that during the Biden administration, President Biden probably made about maybe 4 times the statement that if China were to invade Taiwan, the United States would come to the defense of Taiwan. And the White House every time would follow up with a statement saying that U.S. policy, existing policy, has not been changed. Over the past maybe year and a half or so, President Biden has been shifting his statement, saying that the United States doesn't support Taiwan independence. And I think this is a sign that he needs to say this. There's probably this understanding that by making that statement, he can sort of, how should I say, reassure China and avoid tension in Taiwan, because he has to manage the war in Ukraine and the Middle East and so forth. So the pattern in the Biden administration was that the president wanted to be more clear initially about the U.S. response to Taiwan contingency, whereas his national security team would want to sort of be more prudent and sort of state that there's this policy of strategic ambiguity on Taiwan. One sort of speculation regarding Taiwan is that Mr. Trump's national security team would likely be more forthcoming and forward-leaning in terms of bolstering Taiwan's defense capability, meaning that some of his close aides related to, not all of them, but some of them might be more sort of positive about providing Taiwan with different kinds of weapon system, arms sales, and so forth. I think Mr. Elbridge Colby is an exception. I think he takes a different approach. I think he wants to make Taiwan more serious about expanding their defense capability buildup. But otherwise, I think a lot of his national security team would want to support Taiwan and de facto move closer to strategic clarity rather than strategic ambiguity. Mr. Trump, in past interviews, have said, when asked, how are you going to respond to a Chinese invasion of Taiwan? And he said he doesn't want to make any statements because it's going to affect his negotiation with China. So he has been ambiguous. So from a completely different rationale, President Trump is sort of taking a sort of ambiguous line on how he could potentially respond to a Chinese invasion of Taiwan. And so there's this reversal, right? In the Biden administration, the president was trying to be clear, whereas his national security team was trying to be ambiguous. Whereas in a Trump administration, I think his advisors and the national security team might be much more closer to becoming much clearer, whereas the president would want to be much more ambiguous about how to respond to Taiwan. So that could be a sort of a different change of approach towards Taiwan. But nevertheless, there's going to be a sort of a much more, how should I say, engagement in the defense area. Also, Mr. Trump has also mentioned in his campaign that Taiwan stole U.S. semiconductor industry. And it remains to be seen whether he's going to work upon that statement and try to pressure Taiwan to make more factories, TSMC factories, inside the United States. But that remains to be seen. We'll have to see how he's going to be working on that semiconductor dimension of U.S.-Taiwan relations. regarding technology, I think this is a sort of a common policy line probably pursued with not only by Trump administration, but also Harris administration, that they will probably continue strengthening restrictions on technology transfer from the United States to China. On Harris administration, I think it's going to be a continuation of the stable competition approach. They say that the Biden administration has said that they want to responsibly manage competition with China. And that is about, not only providing arms sales to Taiwan, but trying to avoid raising unnecessary tension with China on many of these issues. So that's what I would expect from the China policy. The Harris administration would also continue the tech transfer regulation regime. They have said that they're going to take a sort of a high fence, small yard, high fence approach, meaning that they're going to target only national security related technology transfer. But the yard has been expanding gradually, right? And the fence has becoming higher and higher, bit by bit. So that kind of trend would probably continue. And that's what I would expect from the Harris administration. Now, the implication for Japan is that we would be happy to see a sort of a robust deterrence, US deterrence in the Western Pacific. So supporting Taiwan is good. I think deepening defense cooperation with Japan and other US allies is good. One issue that I would sort of the implication for Japan is the tech transfer part. China is right now coercing certain Japanese companies that if Japanese authorities go along with enforcing US semiconductor export control regulations, then they will retaliate by stopping certain critical minerals. And this puts certain Japanese companies in a very difficult position. So I would want to see the Japanese government talk more with the United States about, having a game plan before tightening tech transfer regulations to China, meaning that there needs to be a sort of a plan to minimize the exposure of Japanese companies to this kind of Chinese coercion. Because if you expose Japanese companies to Chinese coercion, that's only going to strengthen the Chinese hand. So from Japan's point of view, export control and also investment regulation policies should be coordinated with supply chain strategies, meaning that companies should be allowed to have alternative sources of business if they are compelled to sort of disengage or disengage their business from China as a result of these technology transfer regulations. So that would be a sort of a major policy issue that could potentially arise between Japan and the United States. And I'll be quick, sorry. Korea Peninsula, I think the Harris administration will likely continue existing policy. I think they don't have enough resources and attention to devote to making dynamic moves on issues related to Korean Peninsula, North Korea, and South Korea. Although they raise rising concern about North Korea and Russia's relationship over technology transfer and provision of munitions by North Korea to Russia. I don't expect a sort of a dramatic new policy initiative coming out from the Harris administration at the moment. Regarding Trump administration, I think the question is, will he reopen negotiations with Kim Jong-un? And I think that's certainly possible. I think North Korea, although it has this stronger backing from Russia on the military side, I think they have been sort of pressured by the strengthened US-Japan ROK trilateral defense cooperation. And I think there is an incentive for Kim Jong-un to sort of directly approach Mr. Trump and sort of drive a wedge between the United States and other allies, which will probably not work. But nevertheless, he will have that incentive to do so. And we're not sure how Mr. Trump will respond to that kind of overture by Kim Jong-un, but if he does decide to have another summit meeting and start a negotiation about some issue, for example, on ICBMs or some other issues, I think there will be strong anxiety in South Korea. And we all know that in South Korea, there has been a rising debate about South Korea acquiring nuclear weapons. And that kind of debate might, be inflamed by that kind of development. And there is this talk about rumor that Mr. Trump could be potentially, accepting South Korea pursuing that kind of nuclear armament. And if he makes that kind of statement, maybe, sort of make a quip that kind of statement, then I think that could sort of ignite a debate about South Korea going nuclear. And I think that's far-fetched. I don't think it's going to happen anytime soon. I think it's very, very difficult for South Korea to acquire its own independent nuclear deterrent. But nevertheless, a debate that lacks any sense of reality could be sort of inflamed as a result of that kind of situation. And that's going to have some impact on Japanese debate. I don't think Japan's going to immediately change its opinion and start saying we should also pursue our own independent nuclear capability. I don't think that's likely. I don't think that's likely to happen. But anyway, that kind of debate could unfold if that kind of development unfolds as a result of Mr. Trump's statement and his negotiation with North Korea, potential possible negotiation with North Korea. Unilaterals in the Indo-Pacific, I think Quad, US-Japan are okay, trilateral cooperation and others. I'm quite optimistic about this. I think some people have worried that Mr. Trump might scuttle these frameworks, but Quad was originally conceived during Trump administration. And US-Japan ROK could be considered as an instrument to pressure North Korea. And if Mr. Trump sees these trilateral framework as a sort of an instrument or a sort of a leverage that he can use to negotiate with North Korea, then he might see some value. And I think South Korean government and also the Japanese government is working very hard to how to establish a good head of state relationship with Mr. Trump if he is elected. And if they can work out a good relationship, I think a trilateral summit could continue and hopefully advance some of the programs and agenda that has already been agreed upon. So concluding thoughts, I think one of the big points to sort of keep in mind is that the big picture issue is that traditional U.S. strategic functions and global influence is undergoing change. Traditionally, U.S. has played functions, so important functions in the area of deterrence, trade liberalization, and promotion of liberal values. But in recent years, I think, in the area of deterrence, the credibility of deterrence is now put in sort of question. Not only because of rising power, military power of China and Russia and so forth, but also due to some of the America First type political movement within the United States about how to define U.S. national interest. And so there are questions about to what extent U.S. would be willing to escalate in a regional conflict to protect U.S. allies, and to what extent will they assume risks and costs to defend regional order and so forth. Lastly, U.S. allies and partners will have to adapt to a post-primacy America. I think because U.S. is losing steam in the area of trade liberalization, and also, it's been less interventionist in a way, but in some cases more interventionist, but in terms of human rights and liberal values, I think there is room for U.S. allies and partners to sort of pick up that role and try to engage the world by not only consulting the United States and coordinating with the United States, but U.S. allies that share values and interests with the United States will have to pick up the slack and play their own roles, which means for Japan, Japan will have to play a much stronger role as a security provider in the Western Pacific, and also push for trade liberalization, like CPTPP, and in certain cases will continue to sort of expand social interaction among countries like G7 countries, and also attract talents from around the world to sort of work and study in Japanese society that would be more sort of guaranteeing those kind of liberal values like human rights, democracy, and rule of law. And that's where I think Japan's diplomacy is headed. But it does not mean that Japan will not engage various countries that are not non-democratic. I think Japanese diplomacy will be very pragmatic. So it's not only about the G7 countries and the liberal democracies that Japan will engage, but Japan will also engage emerging and developing countries that are not necessarily democratic, but they will pursue sort of a mutually beneficial cooperation in various areas, ranging from maybe infrastructure, climate change, maybe energy as well. So Japan's diplomacy will probably be, it will continue to engage the United States, and it will continue to engage G7 countries and other liberal democracies, but the third leg will be about engaging the so-called global South countries. So I'll stop here. I apologize for going over time. I'll be happy to take questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Mori. Now I'd like to take questions. To those who are participating today, please send your questions in English using the Q&A function at the bottom of the screen. You can also use the raise hand button. We will take questions from foreign media, followed by embassy staff. I will start questions with which we received beforehand. There are two questions from Mr. Hiyama of AFP. The first question is, the answer to this question, Dr. Mori already might have touched in your presentation, but would you kindly answer to this question? Number one, there is a view that the revision of the Japan-U.S. Status of Forces Agreement and the proposal to establish a training base for the self-defense force in the U.S. are not realistic. Dr. Mori, what are your views? The second question is, what do you think of the intention of the Ishiba administration in making such a proposal from the beginning of its administration? Dr. Mori, please answer.
Yes, thank you very much for those questions. Number one, revision of status of forces agreement and stationing JSDF forces in Guam, I think are two issues that are non-starters from the U.S. government's point of view. And I don't think Prime Minister Ishiba will raise this immediately in his first meeting with the new U.S. president. I think he will be well informed by the diplomatic authorities and also the defense ministry that SOFA revision has global implications for the United States. So even if Japan were to sort of try to work out this issue, the U.S. thinking would be something like, if we work out a new arrangement with Japan, other U.S. allies could start demanding similar revision all over the world. So that is going to be a high cost. And there are much, much higher priorities for Japan-U.S. defense cooperation. And working on that kind of negotiation is going to stall other initiatives. And therefore, it's better to preserve political capital for advancing existing tough questions related to defense cooperation. So that's my thinking. And I don't think Prime Minister Ishiba will try to push adamantly on this issue. I hope not, but I don't think he will likely to do so. On Prime Minister Ishiba's, the second question you mentioned about, I'm sorry, other contentious issues. I'm sorry, could you repeat that?
Yes. What do you think of the intention of the Ishiba administration in making such a proposal from the beginning of its administration?
Okay, yes. I think it's important to keep in mind that the so-called Hudson Institute article was published on September 25th, which was before the LDP party leadership election that took place on September 30th. I should say September 25th that was published. So that kind of that commentary was published not as his position as prime minister, but as his position as one member of the Diet who was running for the LDP leadership election. So you should not consider those proposals to be official policy by the Japanese Ishiba government for the moment. And I think one of the important things for Prime Minister Ishiba to do is to sort of probably publish some kind of article in a major foreign policy magazine stating his policy lines as prime minister, not as his personal views as a member of Diet. And that's what I hope will happen. So people will be able to refer to that as his authoritative statement. And I would also refer you to Prime Minister Ishiba's statement in the Diet. If you read the lines related to defending Japan, you will realize that everything that he says is different from what he said in the Hudson commentary. The basic message that comes out from his statement is that he's going to continue advancing existing policy rather than depart or deviate from existing policy. So those are my reactions to that question. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Mori. The next question comes from Mr. Dorian Margolich of Lacroix Daily. One question. What will be the approach of Harris, Trump, and consequently Japan toward North Korea, which seems less a priority, but could become one in case of nuclear test or ICBM launches? Dr. Mori, please.
Yes, policy towards North Korea. I think for the Harris administration, every time North Korea launches a missile or they do a nuclear test, the past Democratic administration, the Biden administration, Obama administration took this so-called strategic patience approach, which is to sort of respond by tightening sanctions rather than responding in any sort of military manner and so forth. And they have also been reaching out to propose an unconditional negotiation with North Korea, but North Korea has been hesitant and they have held back to engaging the United States. So I don't think there's nothing much more. They've tried, the United States has tried every kind of approach towards North Korea, and it has not worked. And to this day, North Korea continues to develop its nuclear weapons and continues to, sophisticate its nuclear arsenal. So, so far, I think it's very difficult to try to have a meaningful policy initiative that would have any meaningful effect on North Korean decision to pursue nuclear capability. The Trump administration, I think, as I mentioned earlier, he might start a negotiation, start talks with Mr. Kim Jong-il, but is it going to deliver results? I'm not quite sure. During the first time, I think he was ill-advised. He didn't really have any sort of a sense of ultimate goal or anything, but everything seems quite, how should I say, rushed and was not so strategic. If he does start another round of negotiations with Kim Jong-un, we really have to see who's going to advise him on the details of any such negotiation. But there is a possibility that there might be a sort of a partial deal on, trading the hot cessation of U.S. South Korea military exercises in return for some sort of moratorium from North Korea. That happened during the first Trump administration. Maybe they might aim for a similar partial deal in the second administration and see where they go from there. For Japan, it's been reported that there is this idea of establishing a representative office in Pyongyang, but I think it would have to be sort of framed in a broader context, meaning that it's not going to be the Japanese government policy to singly engage, reopen, and re-engage North Korea. I think this goes in tandem with U.S.-Japan ROK cooperation. So any sort of, I don't expect, how should I say, Japan to depart dramatically from existing policy. They will continue to sort of assert the necessity of resolving the abductee issue, but at the same time, there are also concerns on the security side, which is, of course, North Korea's development of nuclear capability, including tactical nuclear weapons and also sophisticated military satellite technology and other kind of military capability. I don't think negotiation is going to stop the North Koreans from pursuing those capabilities, but we'll have to see whether there is any opportunity to sort of move forward on either the abductee issue or the military issue with regard to North Korea.
Thank you. The next question is it's from Mr. Walter Sim from the Straits Times of Singapore. With the ASEAN summit ongoing and amid concerns of U.S. engagement to the region, could you discuss Japan's role vis-a-vis U.S. and ASEAN going forward?
I think Japan's role Japan's sort of I should say approach towards U.S. engagement toward ASEAN or Southeast Asian countries is always to remind Washington that Southeast Asian nations are very, very important in terms of shaping regional order. And I think right now there is this focus on great power competition, meaning that U.S. competition with China is getting intensified, U.S. competition with Russia is getting intensified. And there is sometimes there's a tendency sometimes for the United States to see regional states as a sort of a pawn in a great power competition game. But that's not the approach. That's not how we should be engaging regional states in Southeast Asia and ASEAN states. I think the way to sort of engage Southeast Asia is to sort of consider Southeast Asian states as equal partners in economic development and also partners in developing national resilience, because there has been so many, not only economic coercion, but also natural disasters that have disrupted supply chains, not only regionally, but also globally. And I think one of the common tasks that Japan and the United States and Southeast Asia can share is to sort of establish and develop international cooperation frameworks to enhancing resilience in those areas, ranging from energy, food security, infrastructure, and other, maybe even global health and so forth. So reminding the United States to sort of pursue functional areas of cooperation with us, Southeast Asian states, is the way to go. And I think Japan has been playing the role of reminding Washington about the necessity of engaging regional states as equal partners, not as one player in a sort of a great power competition game. So I'll stop there. Yeah.
Thank you very much. I would like to take one last question. Our president, Mr. Kodama, is raising his hand. So, Mr. Kodama, over to you.
Yes. First of all, Professor Mori, thank you very much for your very lucid expose on this outlook for this forthcoming presidential election and its implications, consequences for Japan, and so on. I have just one question on the Republican Party. As a student of international politics or U.S. diplomacy for many years myself, I think many people are struck by the question that whether or not Republican Party has changed completely. Republican Party has been hijacked by Mr. Trump himself, and simply we don't know. You said Mr. Trump's the trade policy is very much mercantilistic. In fact, traditional Republican Party policy is very much internationalist and more liberal trade liberalization as such. But he has advocated for very much Native Americanism, something like that. So what do you think? Republican Party, this is for just because of Mr. Trump, and then is there any possibility that the Republican Party will return to its more kind of original or more conventional traditional fold or not? What do you think? This is my question. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you very much. My general understanding is that the Republican Party have a sort of the Trumpist wing, which is probably represented by the conservative wing of the Republican Party. And also there is a more moderate wing within the Republican Party, probably closer to the image of a sort of a Reaganite traditional GOP policy line. The relative balance of force between these two factions is that I think more and more, as President Kodama implied, that there's the conservative wing, the Trumpist wing, appears to be enlarging its voice within the Republican Party. My sense is that this trend will continue because the relative balance of forces within the GOP between these two factions depends mostly on domestic issues, I think. And because there's such political polarization, which started in the 1970s, advancing Republican parties, particularly the conservative wing's policy agenda, means a sort of a trade-off situation for zero-sum situation for the Democratic Party, particularly the progressive wing of the Democratic Party. So it is becoming increasingly difficult for the two parties to agree upon national policy to resolve some of the societal and economic problems facing the American society. And the longer this sort of stalemate continues, I think there's increasing frustration towards Washington. And that kind of backlash reinforces the extreme part of the two parties. So if Mr. Trump were to come into office and he advances policy agenda advocated by the conservative wing of the Republican Party, and he is actually successful in realizing and pushing forward some of the conservative Republicans' policy agenda, then there's going to be stronger backlash from the progressive wing of the Democratic Party. And that kind of interaction between the two extremes is going to actually help the conservative wing of the Republican Party, or the Trump supporters, to be much louder in their and become more influential within the Republican Party. I'm not quite sure whether they will completely oust the traditional Republican Party moderates out of the Republican Party. The fact that Mr. J.D. Vance was elected as vice president, I think, is symbolic in the sense that he is more Trumpist and he was accepted as vice president in the Republican National Party Congress. And so as a result, that kind of, my sense is that the current trend will likely continue due to deadlock of domestic political issues and societal issues. So in that sense, I think the Republican Party is undergoing significant change, and it hasn't happened overnight. I think it's been happening over several decades, and it's likely to continue in the foreseeable future. And so that will be the challenge, I think, for the Republican Party. I'm not quite sure whether there will be an inflection point that will urge Republican supporters to sort of change direction. One expert observer of American politics said that if Mr. Trump were to lose, then the Republicans might think that a Trump platform will not sell nationally. But I doubt that. I think this is a matter of sort of almost ideology inside the Republican Party. So even if there is defeat, I think that would only reinforce how should I say, the sense that they need to get back into power, and that they will actually double down on the way they try to sort of win in these elections. So that would be my sense. Yeah.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Professor.
Thank you very much. I think since I have finished taking questions, I would now like to conclude today's briefing. I would once again like to thank Dr. Mori for sharing his time with us despite his busy schedule. And I also like to thank you all for joining us today. Thank you and have a good afternoon. End of the briefing. Mori 先生、ありがとうございました。
ありがとうございました。Thank you very much for coming.
Thank you very much.